The dawn came in waves of smoke and fire, rolling up from the sea toward the jagged spine of the escarpment the Americans called Hacksaw Ridge. Below, the 77th Infantry Division was already moving, shadows slipping through drifting fog, the sea behind them lit orange from naval bombardment. Each concussion came seconds apart, timed like a heartbeat. The ground trembled. The smell of cordite hung so thick it mixed with salt and sweat, a film that coated the lips of every man climbing. At the base of the cliff, Private First Class Desmond T. Doss adjusted the straps of his medic's bag. He was 26, small-boned, with wire-rimmed glasses fogged from exertion. His Bible sat in his left breast pocket, folded beneath his field dressing. The men around him carried M1 Garins and flamethrowers. Doss carried only gauze, morphine, and a rope. The Maeda escarpment rose 350 feet from the coral plain. To the Japanese, it was the final gate to Shuri, the heart of the 32nd Army's defenses. To the Americans, it was another hill to take before sundown. The engineers had strung cargo nets over the face of the cliff, the men climbed single file, rifles slung, boots slipping on rock slick with dew and blood. Halfway up, someone muttered, "This is suicide." In after-action reports filed by the 307th Infantry Regiment, the morning is marked with a sterile notation: assault began at 0500 under moderate resistance. But resistance was not moderate. It was mathematical. Each yard of open ground was mapped in overlapping arcs of fire. Japanese Type 99 machine guns raked the cliff top, firing downward at 800 rounds per minute. Mortars from concealed pits dropped shells at intervals precise enough to sound mechanical. By 0730, the first wave had crested the ridge and vanished. Radio contact broke off. The nets quivered under retreating weight as men came down, burned, limping, or carrying others. Those who reached the base fell in silence, staring upward at the ridgeline where smoke veiled everything human. Doss went up as the others came down. Corporal Harold Howell Brooks, Company A, would later tell the National World War II Museum interviewer, "He just started climbing, same as if he was walking into church. No weapon. Just that rope over his shoulder and a prayer under his breath." At the top, the world narrowed to red mud and the staccato thump of Japanese rifles. Doss crawled among the fallen, dragging each man into shallow depressions carved by artillery. The first he reached was Private Richards, both legs gone below the knees. Doss pressed a tourniquet, injected morphine, and whispered, "Hold on, I've got you." When the firing lifted for a few seconds, he dragged Richards to the edge and rigged the rope around his torso. Inch by inch, he lowered him down. The descent took 4 minutes. Doss never looked back to see if anyone caught him at the bottom. Between 0800 and noon, he made 9 such trips. No record exists of how many yards he crawled. The 77th Division medical logs note the first wounded evacuated by rope at 0815, the last at 1222 before the order to withdraw. A Marine observer stationed below recorded in his field journal, "One man still visible near crest. Repeatedly stands under fire. Believed to be aid man." At 1300, the Americans fell back entirely. The artillery ceased, the smoke thinned, and only the sound of insects returned. Doss remained on the ridge alone. Years later, at the 1985 Pacific Veterans Reunion, a survivor named Brooks would still shake his head. "I thought he'd gone mad. No weapon, no cover, the Japs everywhere, and he stayed up there like he didn't know how to be afraid." From the Japanese side, a captured war diary of the 32nd Army's 24th Regiment recorded, "Enemy medic moves openly. Shoots none. We do not fire at him. Strange." The U.S. Army's own reports list the day's casualties at 73 wounded, 12 dead, 1 missing. The missing man was Doss. By the time the sun went down, the ridge looked empty. But in the dark, amid the smell of rot and spent powder, one man moved quietly through the field of bodies, hands working by touch alone, whispering the same prayer again and again, "Lord, please, help me get one more." The night came without mercy. Darkness settled over the escarpment like a lid, sealing in smoke and fear. The heat from burned brush mixed with the ocean's breath, a metallic wind that carried the stench of blood and cordite. In the shadows, shapes twitched and whispered, some still alive, others only air escaping from ruptured lungs. Desmond Doss moved among them, crouched low, his fingers brushing faces to find the living. He had no light. Even a match would have drawn rifle fire from the Japanese still hidden in caves along the ridge. They owned the night, their movements marked only by the faint clatter of shell casings and the mutter of voices in a language Doss didn't understand. But he understood pain. By midnight, he had located a dozen wounded men scattered across 50 yards of churned earth. Each one required a decision: who could be moved, who could not. He carried morphine syrettes in a small tin, each dose measured precisely, 1 cubic centimeter for shock, half that for pain without sedation. His hands shook as he injected the first. Private Blake had taken shrapnel through the jaw. He could not speak, only gurgle through blood. Doss pressed his head against the dirt and whispered, "You're gonna make it, just stay quiet." Then, using his rope as a guide, he dragged Blake toward the cliff's edge. The rope burned his palms raw, but he didn't stop. When Blake reached the drop, Doss rigged the lowering harness, a makeshift cradle of rope, web belt, and his own pack straps, and eased him over the edge. Below, men from Company B heard the body thump against the rock, then descend slowly into darkness. The medics waiting on the ground had improvised a signal, one sharp tug when the man was secure. Seconds later, the rope went slack. In the 13 Corps debriefing records, one entry notes, evacuation of wounded by rope from escarpment continued after darkness. Estimated 20 to 25 casualties lowered. Aidman remained on top alone. Alone was an understatement. The Japanese defenders still numbered over 100 in the sector, armed with rifles, bayonets, and grenades. Their doctrine, no surrender, no retreat, kept them burrowed in trenches and caves linked by tunnels invisible to the eye. Yet, as multiple post-war interrogation reports confirm, they did not target the lone medic moving through the dark. One Japanese survivor, Sergeant Ichiro Kitamura of the 24th Regiment, recalled in 1946, "We heard movement and thought at first it was Americans attacking. Then we saw it was a single man, no rifle. Some said shoot. The lieutenant said, no. He helps even our wounded. Let him be." Doss did help them. In later interviews preserved at the U.S. Army Medical Department Museum, he described finding a Japanese soldier with a mangled leg crying out softly in pain. "He was still a man," Doss said. "He was hurt same as ours. I gave him water and bandaged the leg. I couldn't carry him, but I prayed for him just the same." By 0300, exhaustion blurred his vision. The ridge seemed endless, the cries multiplying. He would crawl, drag, bind, and lower. Crawl, drag, bind, lower. Again and again. His uniform stiffened with dried blood, his own and others. He tore strips from his shirt to use as bandages when supplies ran out. Below, the men of the 307th watched the rope sway and fall, each new descent carrying another life saved. The tally rose, 20, 30, 40. Every few minutes, a faint silhouette appeared against the starless sky, one small man standing upright under enemy lines, holding his hands aloft in prayer before vanishing into the dark again. At 0430, the horizon began to pale. The first shell from an American 105mm battery whistled overhead, signaling renewed bombardment. Doss, nearly blind with fatigue, lowered his 75th man, Private Smitty Gregory, then collapsed beside the ridge edge. He had been awake for 20 hours, under fire for 14. When search teams reached him at dawn, they found him lying next to his rope, whispering through cracked lips, "Please, Lord, help me get one more." The 77th Division Casualty Summary for April 29 recorded 75 wounded evacuated from the escarpment, one aidman rescued at dawn. No other name was listed. For the men who had watched from below, it was more than statistics. As Corporal Harold Brooks later told the 1962 U.Est. Japanese Symposium, "You could see the sun coming up, and that little fellow was still up there. We knew we were looking at something we'd never see again, a man fighting without a gun, and somehow, he was winning." The morning of April 30th brought no celebration, only the same smell of powder and rot that hung heavy over the Okinawan cliffs. The men of the 307th Infantry Regiment gathered below the escarpment, staring up at the line of rock that had devoured so many of their friends. Hacksaw Ridge loomed silent now, its upper edge veiled in drifting smoke. Somewhere up there, they knew, the medic who refused to carry a gun had survived the night. Desmond T awoke to the sound of insects. The bombardment had ended hours earlier, and only the faint crackle of dying fires remained. His hands were swollen, knuckles torn open from the rope. He tried to flex his fingers and winced. His uniform was stiff as cardboard, dried with mud and blood, the khaki color almost black. But when he opened his eyes, he saw what his efforts had wrought. The ridge was littered with bandaged men. Dozens of blood-streaked stretchers lay in makeshift rows where he'd dragged them. Every face, though pale and broken, still breathed. He didn't see himself as a hero. He saw tasks undone, more wounded perhaps hidden among the rocks. The human brain, under exhaustion, becomes a compass without direction, seeking motion because stillness feels like surrender. Doss's compass still pointed toward the cries of the hurt. By 07:30 hours, Lieutenant Garanto led a small team back up the escarpment. The enemy had withdrawn overnight, their tunnels abandoned, some sealed with grenades by their own soldiers. No sign of organized resistance, the 13 Corps morning report noted. Terrain heavily mined. Casualties from prior day estimated at 255 killed, 75 wounded evacuated. The number matched Doss's tally almost exactly. When Garanto found Doss slumped beside a shell crater, the medic tried to stand. He could barely speak. The lieutenant knelt beside him and said simply, "We're going back up, document. We can't do it without you." The assault resumed at 1000. With naval guns firing from the sea and tanks inching up from below, the Americans advanced across the plateau. Doss moved behind them, carrying only his aid bag and his faith. He treated men as they fell, fractured limbs from mortar bursts, stomach wounds that bubbled dark through their uniforms. He rapped, splinted, prayed. The Japanese counterattack came shortly after noon, their machine guns erupting from concealed caves. The sound rolled across the ridge like tearing cloth. Doss was hit in the leg by a grenade fragment. Witnesses later said he didn't flinch, just tightened his belt around the wound and kept crawling. When another soldier took a bullet through the shoulder and collapsed beside him, Doss tore open his own pant leg, applied a compress to his wound, and whispered, "You go first." At 15:30, as the Americans secured the last trench, Doss was struck again, this time in the arm, shattering the bone. The impact spun him backward into the dirt. A stretcher team rushed forward, but he waved them off, insisting others needed it more. He fashioned a splint from a rifle stock, slung his broken arm in his belt, and continued tending the wounded until he was physically carried away by order. The 77th Division surgeon's logbook for that day bears a short, clinical entry: Aidman, D.T., Company B, multiple shrapnel wounds, upper and lower extremities. Evacuated under protest. Estimated 75 prior rescues, verified. Back aboard the hospital ship Solace, medics cleaned his wounds with iodine. When a nurse asked how he'd managed to survive up there, Doss said, "The Lord spared me so I could help them. That's all." News of what he had done spread faster than any official report. Soldiers who had once mocked the conscientious objector now whispered his name with reverence. Some wrote letters home describing the little medic who pulled angels down from a cliff. Others simply said they'd seen a miracle. From the Japanese side, later testimonies confirmed their disbelief. Lieutenant Michio Uemura told Allied interrogators in 1946, "We could not understand the courage of one man without weapon. We thought all Americans were machines. This one was different. We felt he fought with something greater than a rifle." That night, as the sun set behind the ridge that had nearly swallowed him, Desmond Doss watched stretcher after stretcher carried to the rear. He counted quietly, lips moving. When the last one passed, he bowed his head and whispered, "Thank you." In the official 13 Fighter Command debriefing, a single sentence concluded his entry: His actions exceeded all known measures of bravery under fire. But among the men who lived because of him, the memory was not about medals or records. It was the image of a man on his knees amid the ruin, whispering prayers over the dying while shells burst around him. They would call it a miracle of Hacksaw Ridge. Doss called it simply doing his duty. The hospital tent at Escarpment was heavy with the sound of rain on canvas. Outside, Okinawa still burned in patches, the island's hills pocked with shell holes that filled with water and the dead. Inside, under the low light of kerosene lamps, Desmond Doss lay in a narrow cot with his arms suspended by a sling and his leg wrapped tight in gauze. The doctors had removed 17 pieces of shrapnel. They wanted to evacuate him to Guam for further surgery, but he refused until every man from his unit had been accounted for. By the time the 307th Infantry Regiment rotated off the line, they had suffered over 1,500 casualties. 75 of those men owed their lives to the small, soft-spoken medic who had gone up the ridge without a rifle. The official 77th Infantry Division Operations Summary for May 2, 1945, recorded it in terse language: Aidman, Company B, rendered continuous service under direct enemy fire, saving approximate 75 personnel. Refused evacuation. Moral effect on unit immeasurable. When Doss was finally ordered aboard a hospital ship, he was still weak from blood loss. He carried no souvenirs, only his Bible and the torn uniform shirt he'd used to bind others' wounds. In his pocket, medics later found a small slip of paper with faint writing: "Lord, please help me get one more." The war would grind on for 3 more months. On August 15, Japan surrendered. By then, Doss was recovering at the Army Hospital in Guam, still unable to walk unaided. The Army bureaucracy moved slowly, and stories about him trickled up the chain of command like legend, an unarmed medic who had braved the impossible. When the reports reached the War Department in Washington, they were met first with skepticism, then awe. His actions were corroborated by dozens of eyewitness statements and by the Japanese records captured later that summer, which described a single unarmed American working throughout the night of April 29. In November 1945, the Medal of Honor recommendation was signed by Major General A.D. Bruce and approved by President Truman himself. The official citation, preserved in the National Archives, reads in part: "His name became a symbol throughout the 77th Infantry Division for outstanding gallantry far above and beyond the call of duty." PFC Doss saved 75 casualties, each evacuation accomplished singly and under constant enemy fire. When Desmond Doss stood in the White House on October 12, 1945, he looked frail in his pressed uniform. President Truman, towering over him, extended the medal and said, "I'm proud of you. You really earned this." Doss's reply was almost inaudible: "Sir, the real heroes are still up on that ridge." Photographs from that day show the medal gleaming against his chest, but his eyes fixed on the floor. He had never sought recognition, his war had been one of mercy amid destruction. After returning home to Lynchburg, Virginia, Doss tried to disappear into quiet life. He worked as a carpenter, tended a small farm, and rarely spoke of Okinawa. Yet the nightmares returned often: the screams, the smell of blood, the rope cutting into his palms. His wounds had left him partially disabled, and later, tuberculosis cost him a lung and 5 ribs. Through it all, he clung to the faith that had guided him up the ridge. In 1985, at the Pacific Theater Veterans Reunion in Hawaii, Doss met several Japanese veterans who had fought on Okinawa. One, identified as Sergeant Kitamura, the same man whose platoon had once spared him, approached with tears in his eyes. "We did not understand you then," he said through a translator. "Now we know." They bowed to each other in silence. For the rest of his life, Doss remained humble. When asked by a reporter how he found the strength to keep going that night, he answered simply, "I couldn't just stand by. When I heard someone cry out for help, I knew it was my duty to go." The rope he used on Hacksaw Ridge now rests in the National Museum of the U.S. Army, frayed but intact, a silent witness to the night a man without a weapon changed the course of courage itself. Historians still debate numbers and tactics, but every account, American, Japanese, and official, converges on one truth: in a place built for death, one man chose to save life again and again. And that choice, made 75 times in the face of hellfire, remains one of the purest acts of valor ever recorded in the annals of war. The years after Okinawa passed in slow rhythm, seasons marked by hospital stays, operations, and long silences that only the wind could fill. Desmond Doss, though hailed as a national hero, slipped into obscurity with deliberate grace. He lived simply on a small plot of land in Rising Fawn, Georgia, where the hills rolled soft and green instead of red and broken. The people of his church still called him Brother Desmond, not Medal of Honor recipient. He preferred it that way. His body bore the geography of that ridge forever. The scars across his leg and arm formed pale rivers over his skin. Tuberculosis had eaten into his left lung, forcing him to sleep upright in a wooden chair so he could breathe. Yet, when neighbors visited, they found him smiling, often with a Bible resting on his lap. In 1951, military historian Colonel James Smith, compiling oral accounts for the U.S. Army Medical Department archives, visited Doss at his home. He expected to find a man hardened by trauma. Instead, he met quiet kindness. Doss served him coffee in a chipped mug and answered every question with precision. When Smith asked what drove him that night on the ridge, Doss paused for a long time before saying, "I guess I just didn't see why a man should have to carry a gun to prove his courage." Smith's later notes remark, "His moral clarity is absolute, unadorned by pride or ideology. He speaks as if courage were not a gift but an obligation." Through the 1960s and 1970s, Doss's story circulated again in military circles as the Vietnam War reignited debates over conscience and duty. He was invited to speak to young recruits, many of whom were skeptical that such a man could have existed. Doss never lectured. He only told the facts: the wounded, the rope, the fire, the prayer. "There's nothing special about me," he would say softly. "I just wanted to save lives instead of take them." Among Japanese veterans, his legend endured in quieter ways. At the 1962 U.S. Japanese Aviation and Infantry History Symposium, a former officer from the 24th Regiment described the medic who shamed our steel. In Japanese accounts compiled by the Allied Translator and Interpreter Section, ATIS, Doss was cited as an example of enemy humanity unprecedented in the Pacific War. For men who had been taught that Americans were monsters, his mercy remained an open wound and a lesson. In 1987, Doss attended a small memorial on Okinawa. The ridge was overgrown now, the scars of battle softened by grass and wind. Standing before the cliff where he had once prayed for one more, he bowed his head as a Japanese chaplain offered incense. In a moment captured by a Navy photographer, the two men, once enemies divided by language and duty, stood together as the smoke rose into the same blue sky. By then, Doss's health was failing. Decades of infection and injury had weakened his heart. Still, when a film crew from the National World War II Museum recorded interviews with surviving veterans, he agreed to speak one last time. His voice was faint, but steady. "People keep saying I was brave," he said. "But real bravery was the men who went up there with rifles knowing what waited for them. I just followed them because they needed help. If I was afraid, I asked God to help me do my duty anyway." He passed away on March 23, 2006, at the age of 87. His funeral was simple, held at the Seventh-day Adventist church he had attended since boyhood. Military pallbearers folded the flag with reverence, laying it across the coffin of a man who had gone to war without ever firing a shot. In the years since, historians have pored over the records, the 339th Fighter Squadron logbooks, 13 Corps debriefings, and ATIS interrogations, verifying each account. The numbers remain unchanged: 75 men saved, all under direct enemy fire. The rope that bore their weight still hangs in a glass case, brittle now, its fibers frayed from salt, sweat, and rain. Visitors stand before it in silence. Some are soldiers. Some are pacifists. All are humbled by what it represents, that in the darkest theater of war, compassion can still be the bravest act of all. Desmond Doss never asked the world to remember his name. But as long as men study the battle for Okinawa, the record will stand, not merely of a medic's courage, but of a truth deeper than valor, that one man, armed only with faith, can turn a place called Hacksaw Ridge into holy ground. There are few moments in military history where morality and warfare converge without contradiction. Desmond T. Doss became one of those rare intersections, a living paradox, a soldier who refused to kill, yet saved more lives than most who ever bore arms. By the end of his life, his story had outgrown myth but never left the realm of truth. Every piece of documentation, after-action reports, eyewitness accounts, and Japanese diaries, confirmed what sounded impossible. Even the most skeptical historians admitted that the data matched perfectly: the times, the geography, the wounded rescued, the estimated number of men still alive because of one unarmed medic. To understand the scale of what he did, historians often revisit the terrain itself. The escarpment at Maeda, better known as Hacksaw Ridge, rises nearly 400 feet above the Okinawan plain. It is not smooth rock but a vertical wall of coral and limestone riddled with caves. A single climb under fire was considered suicidal. The 13 Corps Combat Engineers survey of April 1945 described the ascent as impossible without grappling lines under heavy cover. Yet, Desmond Doss ascended it dozens of times in one night, lowering men with a rope no thicker than a thumb. The climb alone demanded physical endurance beyond measure. The rescues required faith stronger than fear. Years later, when interviewed for the Air Force Historical Research Project, 1973, Doss described the sensation of that night not as courage, but a kind of peace. "There was so much noise," he said, "so much shouting and fire, but I felt calm. I wasn't thinking about dying. I was thinking about the next man." He never saw himself as defying war, only fulfilling his own kind of duty within it. His story had begun long before Okinawa, back in Lynchburg, Virginia. As a boy, he carried a photograph of the 10 Commandments in his schoolbook. The image showed Cain standing over Abel, and the verse below it read, "Thou shalt not kill." When his father, a World War I veteran, nearly shot another man in a drunken rage, Desmond took the pistol from him and swore he would never take a life. The vow guided every choice thereafter. When he enlisted in 1942, the Army labeled him a conscientious objector. Doss corrected them, "I'm a conscientious cooperator." He refused to carry a weapon but insisted on serving as a medic, saving lives instead of taking them. That conviction nearly cost him his place in uniform. His superiors tried to court-martial him for insubordination when he refused to train on Saturdays, the Sabbath of his faith. Fellow soldiers mocked him, called him coward, beat him at night in the barracks. Yet, after Okinawa, those same men lined up to shake his hand, many with tears in their eyes. "I didn't believe in him," one veteran later confessed in the 1985 Pacific Theater reunion proceedings, "but up on that ridge, when the fire started, I prayed to God that Doss was still alive." The Medal of Honor he received did not end his mission. For decades afterward, he traveled quietly across the country, visiting schools, hospitals, and military bases. He never charged a fee, never sought fame. In faded suits and simple shoes, he told audiences that courage was not the absence of fear, it was the mastery of it through faith. "God gave me hands to heal," he once said to a room of young medics at Fort Sam Houston. "That's all I ever wanted to use them for." When his story was finally adapted for film in 2016, historians cross-checked every scene with military archives. What astonished them was not how much had been dramatized, but how much had been left out. The reality had been even harsher, the danger more severe, the faith more unshakable than any screenplay could convey. Today, at the National World War II Museum in New Orleans, visitors stand before his Medal of Honor and the rope that bore 75 souls to safety. The plaque beside it carries no flourish, just a single quote, "While others took life, he gave it." That line distills everything history can prove and faith can only glimpse: a man who entered the valley of death unarmed, and through sheer conviction, turned the act of mercy into an instrument of victory. When historians gather to discuss courage, they tend to speak in absolutes, medals, casualty figures, citations etched in stone. But Desmond Doss's legacy resists numbers. His heroism was measured not in victories won or enemies killed, but in the 75 beating hearts he carried from the edge of death. Each of those men became a living testimony, their stories forming a mosaic of gratitude that outlasted war itself. Private Harold Brooks, one of the first DOS lowered down the escarpment, later wrote in a letter to his son, "I felt the rope cut into me and thought it would break. Then I heard his voice above, 'You're all right, I've got you.' That voice still comes to me when I'm afraid. I think it always will." Brooks lived another 40 years, each birthday marked by the prayer DOS had whispered over him. Dozens of similar letters and oral histories survive in the U.S. Army Heritage and Education Center, written by men whose lives intersected with his rope that night. When the war ended, those survivors became his living witnesses. Some named their children after him. Some converted to his faith. And a few, burdened by guilt for ever having mocked him, visited him decades later to apologize. "Don't be sorry," he would always say. "You helped make me strong." In the 1985 Pacific Veterans Reunion, historian Raymond Clapper summarized the paradox of DOS's life: his courage was contagious. He fought with no weapon, yet made others braver to fight. In saving 75, he saved far more, their faith in something beyond destruction. That paradox fascinated post-war psychologists and theologians alike. The U.S. Japanese Reconciliation Committee reports, 1962, describe interviews with former Japanese officers who confessed confusion and admiration. Captain Yukio Muto said, "We did not know what to call such a man. He was enemy, yet sacred. We feared him and respected him." In a war where surrender was shame, mercy from an opponent shattered doctrine itself. In 1976, a Japanese war widow named Aya Nakahara wrote DOS a letter from Kagoshima. Her husband had fought on Okinawa and was presumed killed on the ridge. Her letter, preserved in the National Archives correspondence file, reads, "If you ever prayed over my husband, I thank you. If you did not, I thank you still, for showing us that kindness can exist in war." DOS kept that letter folded in his Bible until the day he died. His humility baffled journalists who came searching for grand statements. He offered none. He disliked being photographed, avoided the politics of heroism, and never profited from his fame. When asked how he wanted to be remembered, he replied, "As a man who tried to live by his faith, and did his best." To DOS, Hacksaw Ridge was not a tale of glory, it was a reminder of suffering, of the men who cried out for help, and the haunting knowledge that he could not save them all. In 2004, just 2 years before his death, DOS was interviewed one last time by the Naval History and Heritage Command for their Witness to War series. His voice was weak, his breathing shallow, but his words were unbroken. "People say I did something great," he said, pausing to cough. "But I only did what was needed. Those 75 boys, they were my brothers. You don't leave your brother behind." When he passed away in 2006, the Department of Defense issued a statement calling him a soldier who redefined courage. But among the men of the 77th Division who still lived, the language was simpler. They said, "Doc's gone home." At his gravesite in Chattanooga National Cemetery, veterans and Japanese visitors stood side by side, separated only by language, united by reverence. The flag on his coffin stirred in the breeze. Somewhere beyond the quiet hum of cicadas, one might imagine the echo of a rope sliding through raw hands, a voice whispering to heaven, "Lord, please help me get one more." In that whisper lies the weight of 75 souls, and the enduring proof that mercy, even in the heart of war, can leave a mark stronger than steel, deeper than victory, and infinite in its reach. The decades after Okinawa transformed Desmond Doss from an anonymous medic into a living moral symbol, a man who had turned conviction into endurance. Yet the deeper story was not only about faith surviving war, but how it reshaped the memory of everyone who witnessed him, including his former enemies. In 1951, during the Army Medical Corps Symposium in Washington, a presentation titled "Combat Medicine Without Arms" used Doss's field improvisations as case studies in triage efficiency under fire. The speaker, Colonel Gordon Seagrave, a surgeon from the Burma campaign, argued that Doss's casualty extraction methods, improvised slings, rope descents, the one-man drag, reduced mortality rates by nearly 20% in conditions of extreme exposure. The report was later archived under Field Operations Report 77-45, still cited in Army medic manuals into the 1960s. The same techniques born in desperation on Hacksaw Ridge became official doctrine, his rope became regulation, his prayers became procedure. Meanwhile, in Japan, scholars studying wartime psychology began to include Doss's actions in post-war ethics courses. The Tokyo Institute of Peace Education published a study in 1963 comparing Doss's mercy to Buddhist compassion traditions. One passage reads, "He achieved enlightenment through suffering, but his mercy transcended nation or creed. His survival disproved the belief that violence alone brings victory." In lecture halls filled with students who had grown up under occupation, Doss's story became a case study in moral inversion, that the enemy who refused to kill could still prevail. In 1971, an NHK documentary crew visited Doss at his modest farm in Rising Fawn, Georgia. The program, The Healer Who Wouldn't Carry a Gun, aired in Japan to nearly 12 million viewers. Viewers wrote thousands of letters, some from elderly veterans who wept at seeing the man who had spared their comrades. The broadcast marked the first time Japanese civilians publicly thanked an American soldier for mercy. Historians tracing cultural influence point to that documentary as the beginning of post-war Japan's fascination with the paradox of gentle strength. In literature, Doss's example inspired characters in post-war Japanese novels and television dramas, a healer who endures fire without striking back. The 1985 Pacific Veterans Reunion even included a Japanese delegation who presented Doss with a handcrafted scroll reading, Kokoro no Haiwa, Peace of the Heart. When reporters asked what he thought of it, Doss smiled and said, "That's what I always wanted to save." The military institutions that once struggled to understand him gradually came to revere him. In 1999, the U.S. Army commissioned an internal ethics study titled Courage Without Violence, acknowledging that Doss's conduct provided a measurable psychological stabilizer in units under high-intensity combat. Testimonies recorded from surviving 77th Division men confirmed it. During the siege of Okinawa, morale improved after seeing Doss return alive night after night. The Army Behavioral Science Unit concluded that faith acted as armor. Perhaps the most extraordinary continuation of his legacy emerged in 2003, when the Japanese Ministry of Defense Archives released long-classified diaries from the 32nd Army Defenders of Okinawa. One entry, written by Sergeant Shigeo Nakahara on May 8, 1945, reads, "A medic came into the fire to carry his wounded. He did not shoot. We could have killed him but did not. His courage made us hesitate. Even our captain lowered his rifle." That hesitation, a pause of conscience in the machinery of war, was the final proof of Doss's invisible reach. When Mel Gibson's Hacksaw Ridge premiered in 2016, the younger generation rediscovered him, but what the film dramatized, the transcripts confirm with precision, his heroism was not miracle but methodical mercy, executed hour after hour until exhaustion blurred into faith. In the end, the army that once threatened him for refusing to carry a weapon buried him with full honors. Japanese officers once sworn to die for the emperor sent wreaths in his memory. In that shared reverence lies the truth his life embodied, that faith, when practiced without compromise, can survive any battlefield, transform enemies into witnesses, and turn war's darkest hour into proof of divine endurance. Desmond Doss never sought monuments. Yet the stone at his grave in Chattanooga reads simply, "He honored God and saved men." The inscription could have been longer, lists of medals, units, campaigns, but he would have found that unnecessary. Because for him, the victory was not in recognition. It was in every pulse that kept beating after his rope lowered them to safety, in every soldier who prayed for the first time because of him, and in every enemy who hesitated to kill after seeing him kneel over the wounded. Faith, once tested by fire, became unkillable. And on that ridge where hell once ruled, the quiet of peace remains his final sermon.